Welcome to the Deep Dive. We have a powerful, comprehensive set of source materials today focusing on a truly monumental subject.
It really is.
We're talking about the concept of individual liberty and the powerful forces that, according to this author, are just constantly working to erode it in modern society.
And this isn't just a collection of, political talking points.
No, not at all.
What we have here is an entire ideological structure, and it's all built around this one central premise, that the state and individual freedom are, well, they're fundamentally competitive forces.
That is precisely the context we need. I mean, these materials offer a really wide-ranging, unsparing critique of contemporary government policy.
Everything, economic, social, military, it's all in there.
And it's all viewed through this demanding lens of constitutional restraint and the absolute protection of individual freedom.
And what's remarkable about the author's work here is how it connects issues that, frankly, the average person probably views as entirely separate.
Like what, for example?
Things like central bank policy on one hand and overseas military bases on the other. He weaves them into this one unified narrative of state overreach.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission here, for you, the learner, is to give you a complete shortcut to understanding this entire framework.
Right.
We need to unpack the author's precise vision of a free society, understand why he argues that government inherently competes with liberty, and explore those surprising connections that tie these, seemingly disparate issues together.
And we really have to begin with the stakes, because the author frames them as immediate and intensely personal.
It's not abstract.
Not at all. He frames the stakes around our fundamental standard of living. Now, when we hear that phrase, we usually think of, material things.
GDP, median income, how big your TV is.
Exactly. But the sources argue that this narrow definition misses the entire point.
So the author takes this definition of the standard of living much, much further, arguing it's far more profound than just material wealth. How does he connect it to those more psychological considerations?
Well, he argues it deals directly with your emotional and psychological outlook on life.
Okay.
It's about whether you feel hopeful or, despairing when you wake up in the morning. It's about whether you genuinely expect progress and improvement in your life or whether you anticipate going backward. You fear that your kids will be worse off than you are.
All those expectations, those hopes and anxieties.
They're all wrapped up in the standard of living, as he defines it.
So the standard of living in this context really becomes a measure of how much control and, I guess, optimism you have over your own future.
Exactly. It comprises nearly all we expect out of life on this earth. It's the capacity to define our own lives, our own path, our potential.
And that capacity is the key.
It's the key. And that capacity, the author insists, is made possible only by what he calls the blessed institution of liberty. So when liberty is diminished, the foundation for that self-definition, for hope, for progression, it just gets eroded. And that leads directly to both psychological and economic despair.
Let's dive right into that core tension then. The author's premise is pretty provocative.
It is.
He says that governments, just by their very nature, notoriously compete with liberty, even when their established purpose is protection.
And he frames the entire history of liberty as this relentless, long struggle against those who desire to rule over others.
A constant struggle.
It's constant, and the source material provides a very specific indictment of how this all plays out in the contemporary United States.
We're not talking about minor policy disagreements here, are we?
No, not at all. We are talking about what the author sees as fundamental abuses of power that directly contradict the foundational restraints of the Constitution.
Okay, so what are some of the primary specific U.S. examples he cites that show this systemic erosion of liberty?
The author lists several, and they're pretty damning. First up is runaway spending and, this uncontrollable national debt.
Which he sees as a direct tax on the future.
Right, exactly. An explicit tax on future generations and a corruption of the currency itself. Then second, you have this monstrous bureaucracy that just keeps expanding its reach.
Into every corner of life.
Every corner, regulating almost every aspect of business and private life. And third, what he calls a total disregard for the core principles of private property, free markets, and, crucially, personal privacy.
And the sources argue that this whole system is kind of capped off by a foreign policy of military expansionism. We'll get into that in more detail later, but he sees it as a necessary component for the internal economic decay.
It's all interconnected in this framework. The author contends that the restraints the founders placed on the U.S. government simply, well, they didn't work. at least not long-term.
Those constitutional limitations.
Yes, the ones intended to preserve a republican structure and protect individual rights. He argues they fail to prevent powerful special interests and factions from capturing the machinery of government.
So how does that failure of those constitutional restraints translate into, actual visible harm to society? What's the economic result of this capture he describes?
The economic result, the author argues, is devastating, and it targets the vast majority of citizens. He claims the middle class is being systematically destroyed.
How? Through what mechanisms?
Primarily through inflation and these debt-fueled boom and bust cycles. At the same time, the poor suffer immensely as their wages are diluted by that same inflation and real opportunities become scarce.
And he draws a really sharp distinction between different kinds of wealthy people, doesn't he?
Yes, and this is absolutely critical to his argument. He claims that the justly rich those who earn their wealth through innovation, production, serving the market,
Creating actual value.
creating real value, they're looted through things like progressive taxation and constant political attacks. Meanwhile, he says, the unjustly rich, those who gain their wealth by buying political power, securing special privileges, leveraging government contracts,
The cronies, basically.
the cronies, they're getting richer and richer.
So the issue for him isn't wealth concentration in itself, but the means by which that wealth gets concentrated. It's a systemic corruption of the market driven by political influence, not free exchange.
Exactly. The author maintains that this dynamic is far deeper than simply needing, more regulations on Wall Street.
It's not a surface-level problem.
No, it is the fundamental system of intervention, of monetary manipulation and political capture that rewards what's called rent-seeking behavior, the buying of influence over productive moral labor.
Now, this is a crisis that we usually view through a domestic lens, but the sources argue that this threat to liberty is no longer just confined to the U.S. This is due to a phenomenon they call dollar hegemony. How has the U.S. exported this crisis?
Right, dollar hegemony. It basically means that the economic health of virtually all global economies is intertwined with and dependent on the stability of the U.S. dollar.
Because it's the world's primary reserve currency.
The primary reserve currency, the standard for international trade. And for decades, the U.S. has benefited from this unique position, but the author argues it has also led to a kind of global irresponsibility.
That sounds like a paradox. The U.S. is expanding its money supply endlessly, essentially bailing everyone out. But the stability of the whole world depends on that same dollar.
It is a profound paradox that, in the author's view, is just designed to fail. While the global demand for the dollar has enabled the U.S. government to run these massive deficits without immediate domestic economic collapse, it has also globalized the American crisis.
So when the Federal Reserve expands the money supply to bail out U.S. banks or fund U.S. deficits,
Inflationary effects and the distortions of malinvestment just ripple across the entire globe.
and the sources point out that this isn't just an American problem, it seems like nearly all national governments are acting irresponsibly.
That's right. Worldwide debt is a catastrophic, growing problem. Irresponsible governments everywhere are expanding their powers way beyond their constitutional or economic capabilities.
Now, what's the goal?
It's what the author sees as this futile effort to force the economic and social outcomes of their design. So they expand, they accrue massive debt, and they plunge further and further into fiscal instability.
Let's talk about the psychological side of this expansion, what the author calls the illusion of security. Why do people tolerate this runaway power?
The sources argue that many people are actively deceived, or maybe they deceive themselves, into believing that government can provide total safety from harm, that it can distribute economic security justly, and that it can even, improve moral behavior across the population.
And that trade-off liberty for perceived security is the oldest trick in the book, isn't it?
It is. But the author is absolutely relentless on this point. If government is granted a monopoly on the use of force to achieve security or prosperity or morality, the historical precedent is crystal clear.
The sources warn that power is, what's the phrase?
Always abused, every single time. That's the quote. Granting the state a monopoly on force for benign-sounding goals inevitably leads to its abuse. The problem is that this illusion of security generates a massive moral hazard.
It encourages dangerous behavior.
Exactly. When people believe the government will always act as a safety net for any disaster, financial or personal, it replaces self-reliance and individual responsibility with complacency.
And it's that complacency, the author claims, that allowed the system to be captured in the first place. He argues that over the last century, the individual has far less protection against the state than a century ago, despite all our technological advances and growth.
It's a really stark claim. The author contends that the complacency of the populace was capitalized on by a specific group, which he controversially describes as organized thugs who weaseled their way into achieving control over the process whereby the looted wealth of the country was distributed.
That is some harsh language.
It is, but it's meant to drive home the point that he sees the system as not merely inefficient, but actively captured by, in his view, criminal interests leveraging state power.
This indictment leads to a final, stark choice, doesn't it?
It does. We are at a crossroads. The author says we must either continue taking further steps toward authoritarianism or commit to a renewed, conscious, and concerted effort in promoting the cause of liberty.
And for the author, that effort has to include some very specific technical and philosophical components.
Absolutely. It requires two things. First, a modern, sophisticated understanding of the magnificence and morality of the market economy, grounded in a respect for private property.
And
second, what he calls the moral and practical urgency of monetary reform. The argument's clear. We cannot possibly fix the political and economic mess until we fundamentally fix the money and take that power away from central planners.
that brings us perfectly to the core economic critique, which is really driven by a rejection of standard macroeconomic theory. Let's start with the source material's critique of the business cycle, recession, and stimulus.
Right. The author challenges the fundamental mindset of policymakers. When a recession hits, the immediate political response is, panic, and calls for government stimulus to fix the problem.
But the sources argue that this completely misdiagnoses the illness.
Completely. Instead of focusing on the downturn, the recession, as the disaster, we should be looking at the preceding boom.
The good times.
Exactly. That boom, which feels like prosperity, is often generated by central bank policy. Credit expansion masks fundamental production distortions and causes what's called malinvestment.
Malinvestment being what exactly?
Investments in projects that the market, based on real savings, could never actually sustain long term.
So if the boom is the problem, then the recession that follows should be viewed not as the disaster itself, but as a painful, necessary period of healing, a correction.
Precisely. It's the market attempting to liquidate those bad investments and restore a productive balance.
So from this viewpoint, government stimulus that tries to short-circuit the recession is just.
It's just forcing the economy to double down on bad, unsustainable investments. The root cause of the whole cyclical crisis, therefore, is bad theory, specifically the pervasive influence of Keynesianism.
And the belief that central banks can turn stones into bread.
Right, that they can create prosperity out of thin air through fiat money creation.
This bad theory, the author claims, generates a tremendous moral hazard in the economy. This is a crucial concept we need to elaborate on.
Moral hazard, in this context, refers to a situation where one party is insulated from risk and therefore behaves more recklessly.
Because they know they won't bear the full consequences.
Exactly. The sources argue that Keynesianism generated a false confidence, a moral hazard of immense proportion. By having the Federal Reserve, regulatory agencies, and Congress systematically signal that they will always bail out failing institutions and stimulate the economy during a downturn, people and businesses are taught to ignore caution.
Can you give us a concrete example of how this plays out in real life, not just for big banks?
Sure, think about a housing market. If investors and homebuyers believe that the government, through, say, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or the Fed, will perpetually ensure high valuations or rescue the lending markets, they are incentivized to take on larger, riskier debts.
Knowing the ultimate cost won't be borne by them.
Right, and this policy actually punishes caution in saving and investing. The cautious investor who held back is then potentially penalized by the inflation driven by the bailouts of the reckless ones.
So if the goal is to cure the bust, the author's solution is very straightforward, yet pretty radical in a modern context.
The prescription is simple: don't create the boom. Economic growth must be based only on real, sustainable factors.
It's like genuine production, voluntary savings, technological advancement. Any attempt to artificially pump up the economy through phony central bank stimulus, the sources argue, only postpones the inevitable correction and inflicts even deeper damage on economic liberty.
This philosophical rejection of central planning brings us to the alternative framework he proposes: Austrian economics. The author champions this school of thought as providing the most robust, principled defense of a free society.
The Austrian school is a fascinating intellectual tradition. It was founded by Karl Menger back in 1840, followed by brilliant thinkers like Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, and later, giants like F.A. Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Murray Rothbard.
And to understand the author's entire ideological structure, you really have to grasp the basics of Austrian thought.
You really do.
So what are the core concepts that distinguish the Austrian school from the mainstream economics we hear about every day? Well, the first core concept is the subjective theory of value. Menger insisted that economic value doesn't reside inherently in a good, like, say, the metal content of a tool, but extends entirely from the human mind. Value is subjective. It changes according to individual needs and choices.
Give us a quick analogy to explain that subjectivity.
Okay, think of the classic diamond-water paradox. Water is essential for life, but it's cheap. Diamonds are, for survival, useless, but they're incredibly expensive.
An objective theory of value struggles with that.
It fails completely. The Austrian school explains that at the margin, so the next unit you consume, the value of water is near zero because we have so much of it, while the value of a unique, rare diamond is enormous because it satisfies a far less urgent but still very highly valued want.
And that leads directly to the second core concept, the unpredictability of human action.
Yes. The entire framework champions private property, free markets, and sound money, precisely because it takes into account the unpredictability of human action. No single central planner can possibly gather or quantitatively know the future decisions of millions of individuals.
Which is why central planning always fails, in this view.
Always. The school explains how order can emerge out of the seeming chaos of individual action, driven by price signals and voluntary exchange. It's the absolute antithesis of top-down state control.
This philosophy naturally leads to a powerful critique of monetary policy, specifically the Federal Reserve's role, which is seen as the engine of all these bad booms.
The sources argue the Fed is essentially printing money or creating easy credit to cover the government's shortfall. Without the Fed providing easy credit and buying up government debt, huge deficits and runaway spending would be virtually impossible to finance.
Which is why the author argues monetary reform is so urgent.
It's the linchpin of the whole system.
And the outcome of this easy money policy, the author claims, is the largest financial bubble in all of history.
That's because the artificially low interest rates distort price signals across the entire economy. It leads to widespread speculative excesses. Investors are forced into riskier assets just to find some kind of yield.
And the government can fund massive projects and wars without immediate painful taxation.
Exactly, which obscures the true cost of all of its activities from the public.
The sources use a fantastic analogy to illustrate the ridiculousness of the current national approach to debt and spending.
It's a very pointed analogy. The source asks, what sane person would advise a debt-ridden individual about to lose his home that the solution is to borrow and spend even more money and sign up for new credit cards?
Nobody. You tell them to work more, cut spending.
Of course. And yet, the author claims that is exactly the advice Keynesian policymakers keep handing the federal government every time the economy slows down. Borrow more, spend more, inflate the currency more. It frames the entire national economic policy as an addiction to a highly destructive narcotic.
This addiction isn't limited to welfare or domestic spending, though. The author introduces a concept he calls military Keynesianism. How does that work, and why does it cross the traditional political aisle?
This is a critical point for his comprehensive critique. The sources argue that while most conservatives criticize domestic welfare spending, they are often strong advocates of their own form of big government through promoting militarism and world occupation.
So they believe military spending is a patriotic jobs program that stimulates the economy.
That's the idea, a form of military Keynesianism.
But hold on, the author calls military spending economically harmful. Surely there are positive technological spillover effects. Isn't that a massive oversimplification?
He acknowledges the potential for innovation, but insists that the net economic effect of spending on warfare is overwhelmingly negative.
How so?
He argues that spending massive amounts of money, surpassing all other nations combined, to manufacture and then blow up missiles, bombs, and vehicles cannot possibly raise the standard of living for the average citizen. It's an economic negative because it diverts capital, labor, and resources away from productive civilian use,
Resulting only in massive debt and no long-term benefits to consumer well-being.
Exactly. And he also points out the added cost of the empire.
The maintenance costs.
Right. The cost of maintaining the global empire isn't just the initial expense. The destruction caused by our weapons or actions often requires American taxpayers to then pay for rebuilding the infrastructure we just destroyed in occupied or sanctioned lands, making the nation poorer, not wealthier, in the long run.
Moving from economics to ethics, the discussion shifts to the immorality of redistribution, which he says is driven by envy.
The source material is highly critical of this. It labels policies like the progressive income tax and the inheritance tax as institutionalized immorality. Because the author contends these policies are not based on justice or economic utility, but are explicitly designed to appeal to the lowest impulses of human nature, envy, by punishing success and harming the justly rich.
Now, what's the practical danger of implementing policies based on envy?
Well, the author argues that policies rooted in envy discourage capital accumulation, they discourage risk-taking, and they cause people to pull back from doing great, innovative things. If the government systematically tries to level outcomes rather than provide equal opportunity and protection, the whole society becomes less productive and less moral.
We see a similar, very sharp critique applied to foreign aid.
Yeah, the author provides a very cynical yet compelling description of foreign aid.
Which is?
He argues it should be seen as taking money from the poor and struggling middle class in a rich country and giving it directly to the rich and powerful, often dictators and corrupt officials, in a poor country. This leads not to stability, but to dependency and just massive waste.
So, if aid is harmful, what is the legitimate role for a prosperous country to help others, in this view?
The author contends that the only long-term benefit a country can truly offer is the voluntary export of ideas
Ideas of liberty, free markets.
and strong private property rights. He explicitly rejects conditional financial aid that imposes central banks or complex IRS-style tax systems on recipient nations, arguing that voluntary intellectual exchange is the only moral path.
Finally, in this section, the author launches a harsh critique of FDR's famous four freedoms, particularly freedom from want. This idea is presented as fundamentally incompatible with a free society.
It's seen as the radical institutionalization of rights that fundamentally undermines all other liberties. The author states unequivocally that pursuing freedom from want, the idea that everyone has a right to material well-being provided by the state, is nothing more than a license to steal.
How does he define it as a license to steal?
Because such a goal can only be achieved by government force, by coercively taking property through taxation and wealth transfer from one citizen to give to another. It necessitates socialist or fascistic schemes of central economic control.
So by mandating that the state must provide for your economic needs.
It mocks the original right to life and liberty, which implies an individual responsibility for one's own well-being. This is where economics and fundamental morality just collide head-on in this framework.
If bad money corrupts the economy, how does that same state power corrupt our social and legal fabric? Moving on to the legal landscape, the sources argue that after 9/11 we saw a severe disintegration of American jurisprudence.
A drastic change in attitude toward the rule of law.
It really is. The sources point out that current U.S. policy, often executed under the veil of the War on Terror, permits the targeted assassination of any suspect anywhere in the world.
Declared an enemy combatant by a single U.S. official, and crucially, this authorization explicitly includes American citizens.
That is an astonishing claim. How does the author defend that controversial statement?
The author argues that this capability represents a profound and frankly scary change. When the executive branch can arbitrarily designate a person, even a citizen, as an enemy, and execute them without any due process, it signals that we are no longer a nation where the Constitution protects everyone equally.
We become a nation of officials operating outside the bounds of law.
Deciding who lives and who dies, yes.
And hand in hand with that is the established precedent of indefinite detention without charges. This violates the 800-year-old principle of habeas corpus. We need to emphasize the gravity of losing that.
Habeas corpus, the right to face your accuser, the right to a lawyer, the essential guarantee that the government can't just disappear you. It dates back to the Magna Carta.
It is the cornerstone of Western liberty.
It is, and the author argues that its violation through indefinite detention without charges for anyone declared an enemy combatant is the abandonment of centuries of legal tradition.
And the justification is always the same.
Security. It's always security. The justification is based on what the author calls the concocted fear following 9/11, arguing that national survival demands the executive adopt a different code of conduct.
But he reminds us of that crucial principle.
That tyranny always begins with the oppression of unpopular minorities. If we wait until these powers target the political mainstream or the majority, it will already be far too late to rein them in.
The sources specifically note the political irony here. They argue that those who favor assassination often regard criticism of it as a sign of liberal wimpiness and sentimentality.
That's right. But the author frames this as a fundamental issue of systemic integrity, not sympathy for any particular person. The right of even the guilty to have their day in court is not primarily for the benefit of the accused.
It's to protect the system itself.
Exactly, to protect the integrity of the American legal system. Once you erode the protections for persons, whether citizen or not, you establish an evil precedent that will inevitably be used against more people more frequently.
This expansion of authority points directly to executive branch overreach. The Constitution intended Congress to be the most powerful branch, controlling war, money, lawmaking. But the author contends that today, it's clearly the weakest.
Congress, he argues, has systematically surrendered its prerogatives.
Why?
Out of a combination of fear, political expediency, and a belief, sometimes brainwashed, sometimes genuine, that national security demands a strong executive. It's a fundamental reversal of the intended design. The author points to historians who argue that the truly great presidents were the so-called weak ones who preserved peace and liberty, while the great presidents often expanded executive power at the expense of those values.
What are the main tools presidents use to write law while, circumventing the legislative branch?
Well, the most direct tool is the use of executive orders. Historically, presidents use these narrowly to carry out constitutional duties and manage the federal apparatus.
But today,
Today, the sources contend they are used for the explicit purpose of writing law. We see examples like President Obama using an executive order to solve the abortion impasse during the 2009 medical care debate. That's effectively legislating by decree. The federal bureaucracy then enforces these orders as the law of the land, completely bypassing congressional debate.
and beyond executive orders, there's the frightening rise of administrative justice through agencies. We need a concrete explanation of how this monstrous system practically affects the average person or business owner.
Okay, think of a small business owner dealing with the EPA or OSHA. Congress often passes these vague laws saying, you must ensure a safe workplace.
Right.
The executive branch agency, the EPA or OSHA, then writes tens of thousands of pages of specific regulations. These agencies then become the policeman who investigates potential violations, and then they become the judge who levies massive fines, all without the need for a traditional court adjourn or the full protection of due process.
So the citizen is often considered guilty until proven innocent, and the deck is just stacked against them.
Precisely. The citizen often can't afford the massive legal defense necessary to fight this vast, complex government machine that acts as investigator, prosecutor, and judge all in one. The author sees this system of administrative justice as completely subverting the separation of powers and basic legal fairness.
Now let's talk about the philosophy that he says justifies this deception and power accumulation, the noble lie.
The noble lie, as defined by the author, is anything but noble. It is the conscious and deliberate act of the government lying to manipulate public opinion.
Usually to achieve goals like war or wealth redistribution.
Exactly. Historically, the sources note, philosophers like Plato and Machiavelli glorified this idea, arguing it was necessary and good for both the ruler and the ruled.
Who are the modern champions of this philosophy, according to the sources?
The author strongly implicates the neoconservatives and others influenced by the philosophy of Leo Strauss, arguing their influence is strongly bipartisan today. Strauss argued that the elite have a responsibility to deceive the masses because rulers are superior and must govern the supposedly incompetent populace.
Which is an absolute fundamental rejection of trust and transparency in what's supposed to be a free, self-governing society.
A total rejection.
If the elite operate under this philosophy, what are the primary tools they use to maintain control over the masses?
The author contends they rely on three key elements: religion, lies, and war. The core mechanism is simple. External threats unite people and distract them from domestic issues.
So if a genuine threat doesn't exist,
Leaders must create one to ensure public obedience and support for expanded state power. This strategy is essential to suppressing individualism and fortifying the ruling elite.
and the government frames resistance to these policies as un-American, using patriotism as a weapon against dissent.
Absolutely. Opposing military expansion or interventionist policies is framed as unpatriotic or anti-troop. The source specifically points out the name Patriot Act as a masterstroke of manipulation.
How so?
Because criticism of the state's actions, even surveillance and rights violations, is automatically deemed disloyal or even treasonous just by the name of the act. The author argues that this noble lie is so pervasive that often you can find more raw truth through independent inquiry than in official government briefings.
The sources argue that government coercion isn't limited to the economy and foreign policy. It extends deep into moral and personal decisions. The author views federal injection into social issues as another form of overreach that should be left to the states or society itself. Let's start with abortion.
Right, which the source notes is rarely a long-term solution and reflects a profound moral question that dictates the society's respect for life.
And the argument here focuses heavily on the constitutional division of power.
Exactly. The Constitution explicitly lists only 4 federal crimes. Criminal and civil laws were deliberately left to the states. Therefore, the author contends that the federal courts overstepped by declaring abortion a constitutional right in Roe v. Wade in 1973.
Nationalizing an issue that fundamentally belongs to state legislatures and, I guess, moral societal consensus.
That's the argument. And this also leads to what the author calls a fascinating choice inconsistency among pro-choice advocates.
How does he define that inconsistency?
The source material is highly critical of the selective application of the concept of choice. It's noted that the strongest proponents of choice regarding abortion often readily support extensive federal regulations against smoking, mandatory seatbelts, restrictions on narcotics, even healthcare mandates.
So he argues their passion for choice is limited to one specific circumstance, the mother's body, and doesn't extend to a consistent philosophy of individual freedom across the board.
Exactly. And the inconsistency becomes most stark when you start discussing the late-term dilemma.
The author challenges proponents of choice to logically draw a line, especially when considering ninth-month abortion.
Right. If the argument used for the first month, mother's body, her choice, is absolute, the source notes, then it applies equally to the third trimester, regardless of any compelling social or medical reasons a mother might suddenly invoke. The fundamental dilemma is defining when one individual's liberty conflicts with another life.
Which naturally leads to the profound infanticide question raised by the author. What biologically and morally differentiates a baby 1 minute before birth and a newborn 1 minute after birth?
Biologically and morally, the source claims there is nothing to differentiate them. The legal, political, and monetary value attached to the human infant in a society that accepts late-term abortion becomes purely relative and political. The author argues that resolving the abortion issue and restoring respect for life is absolutely required for a healthy defense of a free society.
And this is where the liberty argument fully connects.
It connects completely. The source makes a sweeping claim. If all life is not precious, how can all liberty be held up as important? The willingness to discard a life, even based on a claim of choice, sets a dangerous precedent for attacking personal liberty elsewhere. The final resolution, the source insists, rests not with Congress or the courts, but with society's moral and philosophical understanding of the value of life.
Let's move to hate crimes and group rights, another area where the author argues good intentions lead directly to unequal treatment under the law.
Hate crime legislation is argued to fundamentally undermine the foundational principle that all individuals should be treated the same under the law.
How?
By providing greater penalties for crimes against certain protected groups, the law implies that victims without that favored affiliation have less worth, or that the state values some lives more than others.
This also introduces the concept of a thought police into the legal system, doesn't it?
That's correct. These laws attempt to judge the subjective motivation and thoughts of the perpetrator rather than just judging the action itself. The criminal justice system is forced to determine whether the perpetrator harbors hate, a subjective conclusion, to assign punishment, which the author argues is a dangerous precedent for policing thought.
So the author suggests the solution is to drop the entire concept of hyphenated rights, like gay rights, minority rights, and so on.
The proposed solution is to insist that all rights are purely individual and unrelated to any group affiliation. The goal must be equal justice before the law, making skin color, age, sex, and sexual orientation completely irrelevant to the prosecution and punishment of a crime.
And he warns of a slippery slope.
Yes, he warns that if we continue down the path of punishing people more severely for politically incorrect thinking accompanying a crime, it will take a very small logical leap for the government to start punishing bigoted speech, even without an accompanying act of violence.
Next, let's discuss education and centralized control. Federal involvement in public schooling is presented here as a profound, bipartisan catastrophe.
The source material is unequivocal. Federal involvement has not improved the quality of education. In fact, costs have skyrocketed, while local control and parental influence have significantly diminished.
And in many major urban centers, the centralization has coincided with massive increases in violence, drugs, dropout rates.
And yet the bureaucratic complaint is always that they need more money, never that the system itself is fundamentally flawed.
The expansion of the Department of Education and programs like No Child Left Behind prove, according to the sources, that national control of public schools is firmly a bipartisan effort.
This demonstrates the political class's uniform desire to control the narrative. The author argues that the near monopoly control over the indoctrination of young people is the most dangerous aspect.
He cites an example, right?
Yes, the Washington, D.C. school system, one of the most expensive, violent, and troubled systems in the country, yet resistant to any structural change other than demanding more funding.
So what reform does the author propose to challenge this monopoly?
He argues that the best interim reform would be a tax credit for all educational expenses, which would inject competition and empower parents without government funding stipulations. He actually rejects vouchers.
Why?
Because, since they're funded and controlled by the state, he argues they still invite bureaucratic control over the curriculum and standards, which defeats the whole purpose. The sources remind us that the founders were often educated privately or at home, learning classics and foreign languages, a far cry from today's centralized, low-standard approach.
Finally, we turn to the author's very strong moral argument against conscription, which he explicitly equates with slavery.
This argument is deeply rooted in the concept of self-ownership. Since we reject slavery because we fundamentally own ourselves and our bodies, the moral law must prohibit the state from forcing involuntary military servitude, a draft.
And the sources contend the Constitution provides no authority to do that.
No authority whatsoever.
Even if the U.S. has largely operated with a voluntary military for decades, the source argues the underlying threat of conscription is still an outrage.
It's an existential threat. Conscription reminds every 18-year-old that ultimately the government controls their fate and their body. Furthermore, the draft can never be fair due to discrimination by age, wealth, and privilege, with the rich securing deferrals while minorities and the poor suffer disproportionately.
The sources also point out a more subtle form of involuntary servitude in the modern military.
That's the military's use of stop-loss programs, which prohibit members from leaving the service when their tours are officially up, often for months or even years. The author describes this as a de facto draft,
Proving that even without a large-scale conscription system, the state maintains the power to commandeer the lives and bodies of its citizens.
Exactly. And the true solution, the source argues, is a non-interventionist foreign policy that diminishes the chances of war in the first place.
This section serves as the capstone of the author's argument, linking monetary corruption and legal overreach to the necessity of maintaining the American empire and the perpetual conflict required to sustain it.
And the author notes a profound disconnect here. The majority of Americans, he contends, are blissfully unaware they live in an empire. They believe they reside in a free, democratic republic, insulated from global machinations.
But the author argues the U.S. is an empire by any reasonable definition.
Yes. Quite possibly the most aggressive, extended, and expansionist in the history of the world. That's a direct quote.
And the numbers back up the scale of that claim.
They do. The author cites the overwhelming military footprint. U.S. troops deployed in 135 countries and over 900 foreign military bases. This vast physical presence, combined with economic and political influence, meets the classical definition of an imperial power, irrespective of rhetoric about democracy and freedom.
The author argues that this transition from a republic to an authoritarian empire is insidious, and he draws an historical analogy to pinpoint the moment the Rubicon was crossed.
The reference is to Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon River in 49 BC, effectively ending the Roman Republic and initiating the empire. The destruction of that republic, the author notes, came not from internal collapse initially, but from the growth and expansion of Roman military power outside of Rome, which eventually corrupted the governing center.
That raises a chilling question for the U.S.
It does. The author asks whether we have already crossed our own Rubicon, the point of no return, and he suggests that the duration of the American empire is likely to be much shorter than Rome's, which lasted 450 years, just due to the speed and complexity of modern technology and geopolitical events.
This structure immediately reveals an internal conflict. The notion that we can cut domestic government spending while simultaneously maintaining the empire is, according to the author, preposterous.
Absolutely. War feeds the growth of the state apparatus, and the state, in turn, is nourished on the liberties of the people. Empire requires massive centralized funding, which demands the monetary inflation we discussed earlier, perpetuating the whole cycle of debt and state expansion.
Let's discuss the role of the CIA and intelligence overreach in maintaining this global structure.
The intelligence operation is described as a huge, complex, and utterly out-of-control bureaucracy. It costs taxpayers an estimated $80 billion per year, yet frequently demonstrates incompetence.
Failing to act on significant leads, like with the underwear bomber or the 9/11 attackers.
Right. The vastness of the system ironically leads to predictable failures.
And the sources outline the CIA's historical activities that are incompatible with the Republic.
Since its creation in 1947, the CIA has been instrumental in instigating political instability abroad. This includes the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Mossadegh in 1953, assassination attempts, and rigging elections worldwide.
And the author expresses deep concern that the agency is virtually unmonitored by Congress.
Partly because of its disturbing ability to self-finance.
The sources suggest evidence that this self-financing includes illicit activities.
Yes. The author specifically claims there is compelling evidence suggesting the self-financing involves illegal drug trafficking and other clandestine operations, which makes Congress totally ineffective on oversight because the agency doesn't rely purely on appropriated funds. It creates an entity divorced from democratic accountability.
All of this behavior is justified under the umbrella term of the war on terror. Why does the author find this term so problematic?
The author insists that terrorism is fundamentally a tactic and a crime, not a war that can be declared and won.
It's a cliche.
He argues the term war on terror is deliberately used as a cliche, just like the war on drugs or war on poverty, to con the public into cooperating and sacrificing liberty to win a perpetual conflict. The phrase provides an endless excuse for massive bureaucratic expansion, military spending, and violations of civil liberties.
Many Americans expressed shock after 9/11, asking what the U.S. had done to incite such attacks, with leaders explaining that foreign entities hate us for our freedoms. What does the source material conclude about the true motivation for terrorism?
The author argues this is a deliberate deception. He states that the core issue is not hatred stemming from our freedoms, but hatred stemming from specific U.S. foreign policy actions.
Such as
Invading countries, supporting dictatorships in the Middle East, using sanctions to starve civilian populations, and maintaining a massive global military presence, including the subsidization of border expansion for allies.
And this leads to the phenomenon the CIA itself once identified, blowback.
Precisely. If you listen to the terrorists themselves, their message, the author argues, is very rarely about religion, but specifically about U.S. foreign policy. Blowback occurs when our aggressive actions increase resentment and motivate violent retaliation against us. When we fight terrorism by exacerbating the very reasons for that terrorism, occupation, intervention, sanctions, we inevitably increase the violence directed against us.
Blowback also leads to the domestic and international issue of torture and moral decay. The acceptance of torture, euphemistically called enhanced interrogation technique, is forbidden by the Constitution, laws, and basic morality, yet many Americans supported it post 9/11.
The author stresses that civilized societies rejected torture hundreds of years ago precisely because it is immoral and unreliable. When Americans endorse torture, they often fail to realize the reality. The recipients are often innocent people or people who haven't been charged or convicted of any crime, including American citizens. It is a fundamental decline in the rule of law.
And the fear is that this institutional acceptance of torture will inevitably spread domestically as the state tightens its control.
The door has been opened. The author fears that as the economic system continues to deteriorate and social unrest potentially rises, the cries for harsh law and order policies could bring secret renditions and torture to the United States. This demonstrates how moral decay driven by empire and fear ultimately threatens the basic safety of the domestic populace.
Finally, let's cover the author's critique of trade policy and conflict, specifically sanctions and blockades.
The author argues these policies are not non-violent alternatives to war, they are acts of war. Sanctions and blockades, such as those imposed against Iraq or Iran, can only be enforced through violence and killing, especially when they prevent basic necessities like food or medicine from reaching civilian populations.
And the sources also point out their role as precursors to full-scale war.
They are often the step just before invasion, as they were in Iraq throughout the 1990s. The author notes that trade and friendship move nations in the opposite direction from war. He recalls the memory of Roosevelt stopping all oil shipments to Japan in 1941, an aggressive economic act that significantly contributed to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor as a warning against such provocative economic policies.
We've established the scope of the problem. An overweening state driven by bad economics, unchecked executive power, and the noble lie of empire. So what is the path forward? The author strongly challenges the idea that bipartisanship is the solution to these profound ideological conflicts.
Bipartisanship is often hailed as a political virtue, but the author argues it can be extremely detrimental. His point is, if you have two parties that both operate on two sets of bad ideas and they cooperate,
The result is not good policy.
no, it's synthesized policy that is extremely bad for liberty.
He argues that the fighting we see between parties is mostly theater.
Yes. He claims the fighting is usually only over which faction controls the power to pass out benefits and control the flow of looted wealth. On core issues, foreign policy expansion, economic interventionism, the existence and function of the Federal Reserve, and maintaining a strong executive, the sources argue both parties are essentially indistinguishable.
This similarity, then, makes the so-called moderates the most dangerous, in the author's view. Why is that?
Because compromise, in this context, is synonymous with selling out one's principles. The moderates destroy our liberties incrementally in the name of civility, seeking consensus around central policies that are fundamentally statist. Genuine progress toward liberty, the author insists, requires ideological confrontation and a serious, unyielding discussion of principles, not moving closer to centralized bad policy.
One legitimate, nonviolent tool for change, he mentions, is civil disobedience. How does this fit into the ideological struggle?
Civil disobedience is viewed as a legitimate, nonviolent tool for change because its greatest benefit is the publicity it generates. This publicity serves as a massive educational tool to change public opinion and ultimately change bad laws.
He cites the civil rights movement.
He does, arguing it proves that fundamental moral shifts can be achieved by nonviolent resistance that forces the state and society to confront injustice.
The sources specifically reference Muhammad Ali's resistance to the draft during the Vietnam War as an example of heroic civil disobedience.
Ali refused to serve in 1967. He was scorned by the public, stripped of his boxing titles, sentenced to prison. He was ultimately vindicated by the Supreme Court. The author holds up this fight, his stand against the state's power to enslave his body, as arguably the best and most morally significant fight of his life.
One that gave him the greatest sense of dignity and pride.
Exactly.
This action redefines patriotism within this framework.
True patriotism, the author argues, is not blind obedience to government propaganda. True patriotism is standing up to the government when it is wrong and firmly adhering to the principles that protect freedoms. Loyalty must be to the people and the principles of liberty, not to the ephemeral political figures currently in power.
The ultimate battle, then, is ideological, spearheaded by the agitator and ideas.
The author argues that political change is always preceded by intellectual change. The politician, tinkers around the edges, but the agitator like Wendell Phillips during the abolition movement, or Ludwig von Mises in economics, changes people's fundamental opinions, preparing the way for political change. They deal with precise, uncompromising ideas, not fuzzy compromise.
And the power of this intellectual struggle is profound.
Absolutely. The source quotes Victor Hugo, "There is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." The author believes the struggle for liberty is winnable, but it requires confronting the American empire head-on, because an empire that requires perpetual war and centralized control is fundamentally incompatible with a truly free society.
To synthesize this vision for a free society, the ultimate goal of this framework, let's conclude with the author's 10 principles. We need to explore these in detail as they represent the guideposts for reversing the authoritarian trend.
These principles outline the essential elements that must be restored for a truly free society, according to the author. First, the principle of individual rights. Rights belong only to individuals, not to groups. They derive from our nature and cannot be granted or taken away by government.
Meaning no special protection for one group over another.
That's right. The second principle relates to voluntary association.
Which means?
All peaceful, voluntary, economic, and social associations must be permitted. Consent must be the basis of order, meaning the government cannot force individuals or organizations to associate or transact against their will.
Third, property rights are absolute.
Justly acquired property is privately owned by individuals, and government cannot arbitrarily void or seize this ownership. Property is the fruit of labor, and a government that controls property controls the individual.
Fourth, Addressing the economic critique from earlier, no redistribution.
Government may never redistribute private wealth or grant special privileges, subsidies, or bailouts to any individual or group. This is the moral line against policies driven by envy or political influence.
Fifth, individual responsibility, the rejection of that freedom from want.
Yes. Individuals are solely responsible for their own actions and outcomes. Government cannot and should not protect us from ourselves or shield us from the consequences of bad decisions. That capacity for error is essential for genuine liberty and moral growth.
Sixth, the critical principle of monetary reform.
Government may not claim a monopoly over people's money and must never engage in official counterfeiting, meaning a monetary inflation, even if it's done under the guise of macroeconomic stability or avoiding recession. Sound money is the essential prerequisite for honest markets.
Seventh, addressing the empire critique, no aggressive war.
Aggressive wars, including those euphemistically called preventative or preemptive, are absolutely forbidden. The military's sole constitutional purpose is defense of the homeland.
Eighth, the preservation of legal integrity through jury nullification.
Jury nullification, the right of jurors to judge the fairness of the law itself as well as the facts of the case, is a sacred right of the people and should be the courtroom norm. This is the ultimate check on unjust law.
Ninth, related to the conscription argument, no involuntary servitude.
All forms of involuntary servitude are prohibited. This includes slavery, military conscription, forced association, and forced welfare distribution. The individual owns their own body and labor.
And finally, the 10th principle.
Government must obey the law. Government must obey the law that it expects other people to obey. It must never use force to mold behavior, manipulate social outcomes, manage the economy, or tell other countries how to behave. Its function is strictly to protect life, liberty, and property, not manage society. So we have completed a profound exploration of this ideological framework. We've shown how the pursuit of centralized power, whether through the illusion of security, economic planning, or empire, systematically dismantles these foundational principles of liberty, property rights, and sound money.
It's all connected.
The author's argument is that the government, through its inherent competition with freedom, becomes the primary threat to the individual's standard of living and their capacity for self-definition.
You asked for a deep dive to be well-informed quickly, and we've provided a shortcut to the author's core contention that the competition between government and liberty manifests in everything you encounter daily.
From the massive national debt accommodated by the Federal Reserve,
to the curriculum taught in schools, and especially through foreign entanglements justified by the use of fear and the noble lie.
and the author insists that we must reverse this dangerous course from authoritarianism back toward liberty, and that the ultimate decision rests not with politicians tinkering around the edges, but with society's renewed moral values and philosophical understanding.
So here's the provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The source argues that the acceptance of state coercion in one area, whether it's the acceptance of abortion diminishing our respect for life, or the acceptance of debt diminishing the value of our currency, inevitably erodes liberty in all others.
It's a contagious decay.
It is. So considering this tight relationship between moral principle and political freedom, what daily habits or assumptions do you need to challenge in your own life to truly champion the uncompromising principles of a free society? Is your reliance on the state, even in small areas, undermining your own capacity for moral clarity and self-reliance?